They laughed when her name was read aloud. Yet somewhere a widower had been saving a chair at his table. The notice went up in spring, when dust clung to every boot heel that crossed the main street. The matchmaker kept a ledger under the counter, and behind it a tin box with folded letters and photographs that had already lost their corners. Men came in to ask, to haggle, to pretend their loneliness was business. Women arrived quieter, or did not arrive at all. Only their names did, carried in other people's handwriting. Her name came on an envelope with 3 creases and the shy weight of a single coin. No portrait, only a line about her age, a line about sewing, and a line about being steady under weather. The clerk turned the paper to the light as if truth could bleed through it. It did not. He tucked it into the ledger and said nothing to the men by the stove. When the time came to read the list, new entries for those who still watched hope like a sunrise through a fog, the men by the stove shifted to hear better. The clerk cleared his throat. He spoke of 2 girls from the east, of a widow with 2 boys, of a cousin's cousin who swore she was pretty and good with bread. Then he spoke the name without a photograph, and someone laughed. It wasn't loud at first. It never is. It begins like a cough a man fails to catch in his palm. Then it spreads. Too old, someone said. If she had a face worth seeing, another offered, she'd have sent it. The clerk folded the ledger with more care than it deserved. She stood near the door, thin as the light that struggled through the dusty glass. She had no hat fine enough to hide what the years had done, no dress bright enough to borrow youth from its color, but her hands were steady. They had been steady through everything that had taught them to be. When the laughter rose, she did what people who have lived through storms do. She straightened her back and let the wind pass around her. The stage ran late that day. She sat on a bench where the slats had been worn smooth by waiting. She touched the envelope again and again, as if the name inside might loosen into a voice. The paper held nothing but her own letters and a destination that a stranger's hand had written, 3 miles north of the dry willow. Lodging and bread. Honest work. She had seen those words before, and sometimes they meant only a cot in a corner and a hard hand if the floor wasn't bright enough to blind you. But sometimes they meant something else. Sometimes they meant a door that stayed open even when the wind begged it to close. He had waited so long that a man might mistake it for stubbornness. There was a second chair at his table, but it lived with its back to the wall, pulled a little away so it would not scrape when he passed. The plate he kept wrapped in cloth had belonged to someone he no longer named aloud. He set it out some evenings without thinking, then put it away with both hands, as if it could bruise. His fields had grown obedient to him in the way land will do for a man who never asks it to be anything but what it is. But the house did not obey. A house requires a kind of courage that mending fences does not. He had it once, he thought. He could not swear to it now. Still, he wrote, not flowery, not much. A line about bread, a line about work, and a line about waiting. That last one not on paper, only in the way he sealed the envelope. When nothing came after winter and nothing came after the first thaw, he put the second chair closer to the table and left it there, as if furniture could keep faith when the body grows tired of it. The day the stage rolled in, the wind carried grit hard enough to scratch. Hats lowered, eyes narrowed, mouths wrapped in cloth. She stepped down with a small satchel and a look that refused to be counted or priced. The townsmen watched her the way people watch a stray dog, curious enough to stare, too proud to feed. She crossed the street slow, boots catching in seams of old mud, and moved toward the ledger door. In the window's reflection, she saw the shape she had become under travel. A woman scraped thin by the road, face plain as unpainted wood, back still refusing to bend. She looked away from it and went inside. The clerk met her with a glance that weighed more than it should. He slid the ledger open with the same careful hands that had closed it. No one laughed now. The stove had gone quiet. She placed the envelope on the wood, her fingers at its corners as if to still a tremor. She asked nothing. He answered by pointing at the line, 3 miles north of the dry willow. She held that direction in her throat like water she was afraid to spill. Outside, the air felt newer. She turned her face to it and began to walk. The road out of town tried its old tricks, the long stretch that looks close, the hill that gives small promises and takes them back at once. But she set one foot ahead of the other until distance remembered how to be covered. On his rise, the widower watched the sky and listened for the shape of wheels that did not come. He did not call it hope. He did not call it anything. He fed the horse, checked the latch of the barn, carried water until he could feel it in his back, and then he stood at the gate with one hand on the wood until his fingers warmed it. Near sundown, the dry willow showed itself, the kind of tree that had forgotten what shade was for. Beyond it, a track turned toward the ridge. She followed. Her boots found the rhythm of a place that had not been waiting for her, and yet somehow had. The house appeared the way a face does in fog. First the edges, then the old lines, then the eyes that belonged to windows too long without a hand to clean them. He was only a shadow beside the fence until he wasn't. The hat brim, the coat that had earned each crease, the stillness of a man who had learned not to frighten skittish things. She stopped outside the gate. The road slid off her shoulders and pooled in the dirt at her feet. He raised the latch. He did not smile. He did not speak. He opened the gate and stood back so she could pass, as if a whole life could be welcomed with nothing but room made at the right time. Behind her, the laughter in town faded into the kind of silence that remembers. Before her, the yard waited, and the chair, and a house that would test both of them until it yielded. She stepped through. The gate closed, wood against wood, with a sound like a promise made without words. He let the gate swing shut behind her and walked ahead without hurry. The yard held the day's last warmth. A rope creaked. A chicken settled in dust. She followed the line of his shoulders to the door and stopped there, her hand on the frame as if asking it for permission. He pushed the latch and stood aside. She stepped in. The air was quiet and stale. Dust rose from the floorboards in small ghosts and drifted through a blade of evening light. The room had a table, a single chair, a shelf with jars that remembered better years, and a stove that bore the black thumbprints of many winters. On a peg, a coat. On the windows, the breath of old storms dried into a dull film. She set the satchel down by the leg of the table and kept her fingers on the strap a moment longer than needed. The road still shook inside her bones. He crossed to a cupboard, took out a wrapped loaf, and set it on the wood. Then a tin cup, then a knife. Each thing placed with care, not ceremony. He poured water. It tapped against the cup like small rain. He did not speak. She did not either. He pushed the knife toward her by a thumb's width. It was enough. She unwrapped the cloth and saw the bread's uneven crust, split from heat and time. She cut a thin slice, then another, and set the knife back so the handle pointed to him. He shook his head once. She understood. She ate the first piece slow, the second slower, the taste of flour and smoke waking a body that had decided days ago to grow quiet. He pulled the chair from its corner and turned it toward the table. He did not sit. Not yet. He stood like a man at a graveside, hat in both hands, unsure where to place them. She reached for the cup, drank, wiped her mouth with the base of her palm. The water hit her empty stomach like a bell. The window was a shallow mirror. She lifted the latch. A thin breath of evening carried the long smell of grass and horses and something clean. She breathed it as if the lungs needed teaching. In the softened light, the room changed. Not much. Enough to show the wood's old lines and the years his hands had worked here alone. He moved down the short hall and opened a second door. The hinges complained in a friendly way. A small room, a bed with a blanket folded once, a basin, a nail in the wall for a shawl, bent a little, as if someone had tried to straighten it and given up. He stepped back so the doorway held only her. She crossed the threshold and placed 2 fingers on the blanket, testing its truth. She set the satchel on the trunk at the foot of the bed and pressed the lid to make sure it would hold her things without arguments. When she returned to the main room, the table had 2 tin plates. He had fetched another from somewhere, wrapped likely in old cloth, the way a man hides what he is not ready to throw away. He laid one in front of her and left the other near his own place. A quiet decision she could refuse if she wanted. She did not refuse. They ate with the simple rhythm of people who understand hunger. Bread, a spoon of cold beans he found at the back of the stove, and warmed without ceremony. Water, no wine, no talk. Outside, a bird called once and thought better of it. The world around the house drew in like a cloak. She watched his hands between bites. The cuts across his knuckles, the clean nails, the old burn on the wrist where a kettle had been impatient. He watched nothing, or else he watched everything without letting his eyes rest. The second chair creaked. It held. When the plates were empty, she rose and carried them to the basin. She washed and dried them with the corner of her skirt, then set them side by side, touching edges. The gesture was small. A man might miss it. He did not. He fetched a lamp, trimmed the wick, and struck the match. The flame took its time, deciding to live. When it did, the glass threw a thin circle over the table, and the dust became a constellation. She pulled a thread from her sleeve where travel had cut it loose. She licked the end, threaded a needle from a little roll in her satchel, and stitched 3 steady strokes. The dress closed around the tear as if it had never given up. He set a folded cloth on the table within her reach. It was not clean. It was cleaner than nothing. She dabbed the damp hem with it and did not look up. In the doorway, his hat hung like a quiet moon. He lifted it, turned it once in his hands, and placed it on the peg again. Then he took a small step toward the shelf where he kept a single keepsake, a cup with a hairline crack. He reached for it, stopped, and left it where it was. Some things you do not place in new light on the first evening. He opened the door a hand's width and stood in the frame, listening to the yard decide to sleep. She crossed to the window and closed the latch she had lifted. Night pressed its face to the glass and looked in without malice. She drew a breath that did not tremble. He let the door shut. When it was time, he pointed once down the hall. She nodded once. That was enough. She lifted the satchel and carried it to the small room, the blanket waiting like a promise no one dared speak. Before she stepped through, she glanced back at the table. 2 plates drying in the lamplight, 2 chairs facing the same flame. She placed one palm flat on the doorframe and felt the grain of the wood under her skin, the lines like a map that could be learned if you had patience. He blew out the lamp. The house fell into a darkness that did not frighten. In the kind of silence that has room in it, a man lay down in his room and a woman lay down in hers. Between them, boards and nails and the first small, stubborn decision to stay. Morning found her awake before the rooster. The small room held its shape, bed, trunk, basin, and the blanket had not slipped in the night. She folded it once, square and firm, the way hands make a promise without troubling the mouth. The water in the pitcher remembered cold. She washed her face and wrists, smoothed her hair with the flat of her palm, and pinned the loose ends back as best she could. The nail on the wall was still a little crooked. She hung her shawl on it anyway, and it learned its duty. Outside, an axe spoke. The sound came clean and regular, a heartbeat made of wood. She lifted the window latch, felt air that still kept a knife in it, and let the room breathe. Dust rose and turned gold in the early light. She watched the floating specks and understood what her first hours here needed to be. The kitchen was not unkind, only neglected. A house that had been asked too long to keep itself. She rolled her sleeves and moved without noise. First the shelves, cloth dampened, jars lifted, rings of pale underglass wiped away. Then the sill where the fly bodies lay like mist snow. Then the panes themselves, 2 at a time, until the hills outside stopped looking like a rumor and became land again. At the pump, the handle bit her palm. She leaned into it, felt the old iron argue, then yield. Water came sudden and hard, the way some mercies do. She filled a bucket and carried it close to her chest, small spills cooling the fabric, leaving darker shapes where the road stain had set. On her knees, she scrubbed the boards. The grain rose under the rag. Lines appeared like the first words on a page that has waited too long. When he came in from the yard, sunlight still on his shoulders, he stopped at the door. He did not ask what she was doing. He stood a moment, reading the room the way men read fields. What has been turned, what needs the next pass, what will hold if you do it right. Then he set down a sack of flour, a wrapped bar of lye, and a small tin of salt. He left them without comment, as if the house itself had requested them. She nodded without lifting her eyes and kept her rhythm. He walked to the back step and knocked mud from his boots with a stick cut to the purpose. The stick was worn to his hand. He hung his coat, sleeves still warm with work, and crossed to the loose hinge that had been talking in a thin voice since yesterday. He took a screwdriver from a drawer that held little and returned with its weight in his palm like an old friend. 2 turns. The complaint quieted. He pressed the door open and closed twice to be sure. The house answered less sharply. He moved to the window whose latch was stubborn. A tap with a bone-handled knife. It gave. He left the knife by the sill, Blade turned in. By noon, the table had been washed to the color of plain bread. She set the tin plates on the shelf with space between them, as if not to crowd their new understanding. From the stove, a low heat, she mixed water and flour with her fingers and let the small dough rest in her cupped hands. The skin of it turned smooth. She pressed it flat and set it on the iron. The smell that rose was not yet richness, only the first polite sign that a kitchen remembers its work. He returned with a bucket of water balanced easy and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He laid the bundle on the table and stepped back. She unrolled it. A wooden spoon, sanded clean, a fork with two straight tines, a little wedge of cold beans she could coax into more than its size. She met his eyes for the length of a breath and set the spoon beside the iron, letting the handle warm so it would not shock her hand when she took it. They ate standing. Flatbread broken in halves, beans warmed to a soft patience, salt pinched between finger and thumb. He did not count the bites and she did not hurry them. When the last piece was gone, she wiped the board with a damp cloth and hung the cloth near the stove so it could dry without stiffening. He rinsed the tin plates and left them to drain, edges catching light. The afternoon gave itself to corners. She found a trunk with a swollen lid and a lock that had forgotten its manners. He knelt beside it and lifted with both hands until Wood remembered the shape it ought to make. He did not look at what lay inside. He closed it, stood, and stepped away so the space would belong to her if she wished it. She set aside a frayed blanket to mend later and folded two shirts she discovered where no one had reached for months. She laid them in a clean stack, squares neat, seams aligned. He moved along the baseboards with a small hammer, setting nails whose heads had lifted enough to catch a hem. Tap, tap, tap. He worked by feel more than sight. She paced herself to that quiet rhythm and learned the floor the way one learns a body, where it complains, where it sings, where it needs a hand. Near evening, a wind came down off the ridge. It pressed the house, tested the chinks, and found fewer than it had yesterday. She drew the shutter and set the hook. He brought in wood, 3 lengths at a time, stacked near the hearth into a wall that would not fall during the night. He set the lamp on the table but did not light it yet. They stood in that almost light, the room open enough to hold them without scraping. She found the crooked nail again and looked at it for what it was, a thing that could be persuaded. She took the back of a spoon, wrapped it with cloth to blunt the shine, and tapped the steel until it settled truer. Her shawl hung straighter. It looked like it belonged to a person who believed in days arriving one after another with work in them. He fetched a broom from the porch, long handle, bristles thinned, and left it by the door where a hand could find it in the morning without searching. From his pocket, he brought a small lump of something wrapped in paper. He placed it beside the stove. When she opened it, she found yeast, dry and fine. He had not bought it today. He had kept it as a man keeps seeds through a long winter. She pressed the paper shut again, eyes on her hands. The gift was not loud. It was better for being quiet. When the first star took hold in the strip of sky, she could see from the sink. She lifted the iron lid and banked the coals. He trimmed the lamp and set its flame to a sensible height. No waste, no meanness. 2 chairs faced a warm square on the floor. They did not take them yet. Some evenings must earn the sitting. Before the light fell fully, she stepped out to the threshold and looked over the yard. The axe had been set aside, blade buried in a stump to keep it honest. A coil of rope lay like a sleeping snake. The chicken leaves had printed the dirt with their small insistence. Above the fence, the horizon lay in a long line that did not defend or accuse. She drew one slow breath and felt the day inside her settle into a shape. She went back in and washed her hands, slow, with a piece of lye so thin it flexed. She set it to dry in a saucer she found on the top shelf, the one with a crack a man had decided was not a wound, but a story. He lifted the second chair, tested the loose leg, and worked a sliver of cedar under it until the wobble went quiet. The chair met the floor with all 4 feet. He let his palm rest on its back for a moment longer than needed, and then stepped away. When night came proper, they ate again. Little, not nothing. She cut a final round of flatbread and set half of it aside under cloth, a habit from roads where tomorrow often arrived unprepared. He poured water and refilled the bucket for morning, leaving it where an arm asleep with fatigue would not trip over it in the dark. She closed the window and drew the latch. He checked the door. The house took their motions and learned them. In the hallway, she paused, touched the frame with 4 fingers, and turned those fingers into a fist as if to hold a piece of the wood for later. He stood in the kitchen, not quite alone, and watched the lamp lean into its own glow. It was not triumph, it was better. Work done, corners obeying, a table honest enough to eat from. A woman who had been measured and mocked laid a clean cloth over a board and made it ready for bread. A man who had waited without calling it waiting set a chair right and left it by the fire. Between those two simple acts, a life found a place to begin again. The house learned their footsteps before it learned their names. By evening it anticipated them, and by night it carried them like a quiet tune. She set the small paper of yeast near the stove and poured a little warm water into a bowl. Flour followed, sifted through her fingers as if to test the air. The mixture woke slow, soft bubbles rising with the patience of seeds. She added more flour and turned the dough until it gathered itself into a single will. It stuck to her palm, then let go. It grew smooth under the heel of her hand. She folded it once, twice, and set it under cloth where the lamp's low heat could speak to it in a language it understood. He worked at the table without sitting. A splinter had raised its head along the edge where sleeves might catch. He took a knife and shaved it down to a harmless memory. Then he rubbed the place with a sliver of tallow until the grain lay flat and quiet. He checked the leg he had fixed and pressed weight into the seat with both hands. 4 feet answered at the same time. He let his palms rest there, then stepped away. Outside, the last light of day fell behind the ridge. He carried in wood, 3 at a time, and stacked it so the pile would not betray them with a midnight collapse. He stirred the coals not to rouse them, but to understand them. Some fires require urging, some simply need room. This one asked only for respect. He gave it and closed the stove with a sound that never frightened, only told the room what would happen next. She lifted the cloth on the bowl. The dough had risen as if it had been promised a future. She punched it down gently and turned it again, a rhythm that steadied the hands even when the mind wandered toward old places. She shaped a round and nested it in the iron pot, its lid heavy and loyal. The pot went to the oven, the door shut, and the heat gathered like a friend who listens more than he speaks. He knelt at the hearth to fix a hinge on the ash box that had been hanging by one screw. The screwdriver slipped once and bit his thumb. He did not curse. He pressed the wound to his shirt, waited for the sting to pass, and returned to the work. He felt her eyes on him for the space of one breath and heard them leave again. Some concern is gentler when it looks away. Steam fogged the small window. She wiped it with the heel of her hand and saw the yard soften into the kind of darkness that does not threaten. She set a pot of water near the back of the stove to keep the air kind to the bread. She touched the shawl on the peg, not to move it, but to know it would be there later. Her finger paused on a loose thread. She smoothed it flat and walked back to the stove. He brought a tin of coffee from the cupboard and set 2 cups on the table. He measured carefully as if the beans were a sum he had sworn to keep. When the water took the grounds and lifted their bitterness, the room changed a shade. He poured a little into each cup and left them to cool so tongues would not learn fire the hard way. When she lifted the iron lid, the first breath of bread met them both. It was not a memory. It was a present tense. She closed her eyes not to praise it, simply to catch it whole. He stood very still, the way a man stands when a wild animal chooses not to run. She set the pot on the board and tipped the loaf free. The crust had cracked like high country after rain. She tapped it with a fingernail. The sound was hollow and right. He turned the second chair toward the stove, and then turned it back as if to test restraint. She did not sit. She cut the bread while it was still too hot for proper manners, and burned her fingertips a little. The pain felt like proof. He split a log with his hands and laid it near the door, an old habit, then returned and stood with his weight even between both feet. They ate in the shadow of the stove, standing. Butter would have been a miracle. Salt was enough. The crust cut their gums a little. They did not mind. The coffee waited, then gave them its small strength. She watched the steam rise from her cup and thought about a road that no longer made demands. He watched the loaf diminish and decided tomorrow required flour with more generosity. He would go to town if the weather allowed. He did not tell her. He did not have to. When the first hunger eased, she wrapped the remainder in cloth and set it on the shelf with the plates. She placed it between them, not above, not below. He noticed and went to the door to listen to the yard settle. The horse snorted once, found hay and believed in it. A chain tapped the side of a bucket. Far off, a coyote considered itself and changed its mind. The lamp burned low, steady. She took needle and thread again, this time to the hem that had learned the wrong length from miles of dust. She sewed the difference out of it with small, even strokes. He pulled a boot from under the bench and checked the sole with a thumb. A nail had loosened. He found a small hammer, the head polished by use, and set the nail back where it would do its work without complaint. He set the boot beside its brother and laid a stick across them, so leather would remember the shape he preferred. She went to the shelf and reached for a mug with a thin crack. She set it on the table and stared at the fracture until the line stopped looking like a threat and started looking like a road. She poured water into it and drank. The crack held. She wiped the rim with a corner of cloth and put it back exactly where it had stood before. He watched the gesture, the way a man watches weather for lessons. He took the knife from the sill and picked up a scrap of cedar from the woodpile. He shaved it down to a small wedge and slid it into the gap at the window, where the frame had become honest about its age. The draft softened. She felt it on her wrist where the air had been sharp and let her hand stay there a moment longer than necessary. The night moved forward. They did not outpace it. They walked with it. She banked the stove until it agreed to keep a low fire and not require compliments. He trimmed the lamp and cupped the glass as if it could be startled into breaking. The room became the kind of dim a body can rest in. She lifted the cloth from the bread again, just to look, and then covered it like a child returned to sleep. He placed the screwdriver back into a drawer that now held exactly what he said it did. Before sleep, she went to the doorway and rested her palm flat against the frame. Her fingers spread, then closed, as if to take something of the wood with her. He went to the porch and stood for 4 breaths under a sky that held every star it could carry. He did not pray. He did not pray. He listened. The land said what land says to those who stand still long enough to hear it. You may stay if you work. They put out the lamp. The dark was clean. In their separate rooms, they lay down not as strangers and not yet as anything else. Between them, the house held heat in its joints and smelled faintly of coffee and bread. Somewhere a board popped and then remembered itself. On the shelf, a loaf waited for morning. In the kitchen, 2 cups dried side by side, catching the last of the warmth as if it could be saved. Morning broke clear and thin. The ridge wore a pale line of light like a thought it would soon remember. He saddled the horse without noise, checked the cinch twice, and tied 2 empty sacks behind the cantle. She folded a cloth over the remaining loaf and slipped it into his hand as if placing weight on a scale that needed balancing. He nodded once. The gate latched softly behind him. She cleaned while he was gone. First the stove top, then the ledge above it, then the corner where Ash had chosen a home. The broom learned her measure. The house accepted correction without pride. By mid-morning, the rooms held a simple order that felt less like conquest and more like agreement. Dust rose on the far track before noon. The horse came steady. He dismounted and set the sacks on the table. Flour, coffee, salt, a coil of waxed thread, 2 needles, a bar of soap with a maker's mark shallow as a whisper, and last, wrapped in brown paper and string, something that held its shape in a way a body recognizes. He left the package where it landed and stepped to the pump to wash travel from his hands. She wiped the table edge, then untied the string. Inside lay boots, plain, stout, with stitching honest enough to show. Not new enough to make a noise about themselves, not old enough to be a problem before winter. She looked at him and then down, as if the floor would read what her mouth refused to write. He set a small tin beside them, salve for leather. She drew 1 boot closer, pressed the heel with her thumb, turned it, and felt the sole's edge where it had been pegged. The work was not fancy, it was good. She did not try them on, not yet. She wrapped them again with the gentleness of people who know how little is required to tear what is given. He eased the horse, rubbed its neck where sweat had dried, and forked hay into the manger. When he returned, she had put the coffee to the stove and set 2 cups on the board. She motioned with her chin at the package, a question without a mark. He answered by drawing it nearer to her place. The matter rested there. In town, the morning had not traveled quiet. The store's stove had gathered men with time to spend and mouths that feared silence. He had felt their looks when he asked for women's sizes. He had watched the shopkeeper glance past his shoulder at the door as if waiting for a punchline. A man at the nail barrel had coughed a laugh he never apologized for. A remark had followed, lightly thrown, meant to bruise without leaving a mark. He had not raised his head to meet it. He had counted out coin and watched the shopkeeper's hands smooth paper as if decency could be flattened into something easier to store. Now at home, none of that crossed the threshold. He left town on the far side of the ridge. The house received only what the house needed. In the afternoon, he cleaned tack under the porch edge where shade kept the leather from arguing. She sat on the step with a shirt across her knees. The cuffs had frayed until they became their own kind of lace. She turned the edges under and stitched them into obedience. He used a bone tool to rub oil into the reins until they remembered flexibility. They worked within arm's length and did not steal each other's breath. When the heat let go, he lifted the package again and set it at her feet. She unwrapped the boots and pulled the old pair from her feet. The cracked leather sighed as she set it aside. She slid her toes into the new ones. The fit held firm but not unkind. She stood and took 3 steps on the hard-packed yard. The boots answered. She made a 4th step because it felt like relief. He watched her walk as a man watches the level of a beam under a roof he intends to sleep beneath. She stopped and looked down at her feet, as if apologizing for the time she had spent asking too much of them. Then she sat again, lifted one boot, and worked the salve into the leather with both thumbs until the surface found its old color. Toward evening, she carried a small pail to the fence line and picked the tough grass that grows where wind forgets to kneel. She tied it into a neat bundle for the stove to smell when winter came. He set a new latch on the coop door where a fox had once found education too easy. He tested it twice, then set a stone at its base because wood alone had not convinced the world of their seriousness. When the sun went down thin and wide, they ate at the table. Bread became toast on the stove lid. Beans learned patience again. He poured coffee, and steam made a brief map above each cup. They ate without speed. She placed the old boots beneath the bench and set the new ones side by side with their toes pointed toward morning. He noticed and put the salve tin directly above them on the shelf, alignment that said, "This is not luck. This is care." After the meal, she washed the cups. He dried them with a cloth that had been made for some better day and never found it. He shook the cloth, folded it along an old crease he did not make, and laid it flat. She drew the lamp down a touch. The flame held. When night gathered, they went to the porch and sat. The rail bore no letters here, no marks yet, only the long wear of weather. Stars raised their 1,000 small lanterns. From town, the thought of laughter drifted like smoke that had lost its fire. It did not find purchase. She rested one ankle over the other and felt the boot leather bend in a way that promised use, not surrender. He set his hat brim back with 2 fingers and let the night take the length it required. The house behind them kept its soft agreements. The fixed hinge, the steady chair, the wrapped loaf, the salve tin above the boots. Some love arrives with words and vows in a room full of witnesses. Some arrives in paper and string, a coin counted without flinching, a walk across a bare yard in boots that do not hurt. That night asked for nothing more. They gave it what it asked. She wore the new boots in the morning and learned their weight with the yard's first lap. Leather answered without complaint. He checked the sky, the horse, the latch, then nodded toward the road. Mark it again, not for talk, for flour, nails, a bolt of sense. They rode the flats in silence. The sun came up without noise and set shine across the river stones. At the edge of town, she touched the satchel strap and set her jaw as if fastening it to her bones. He slowed the horse before the boards began, let the animal's hooves climb the rhythm of planks without hurrying. He dismounted first, tied the rein, and offered a hand. She did not need it. He kept it there anyway, not insisting, not withdrawing. She stepped down on her own, then let her palm brush his knuckles for the length of a blink. It was enough to say she had seen the hand. Inside, the store smelled of rope and sugar. Men formed a winter of backs around the stove. A clerk moved ledgers like cards. The notice board sat where it always sat, wood pocked by years of forgotten promises. Her old paper had curled at one corner, the edges browned, her name there in the letters she had written alone in a room that did not belong to her. A thumbprint stained the bottom where someone had pressed too hard. No one had bothered to smooth it. She stared at it until the room thinned. Not the words, Those were still true enough in their way, but the memory of a laugh that had rolled across her skin like grit. She lifted a hand and did not touch the page. The clerk watched from behind the counter, his mouth careful. He had ironed his tone since the last time. He walked past her to the board and set his thumb on the nail. 2 pulls. The paper let go. He folded it twice, neat, and placed it in her palm. Not as a trophy, as a thing completed. She put it into the satchel without looking down, as if to teach her hands not to shake when they handled their own past. The store moved. Men turned their heads as if bored suddenly by their own talk. He stepped to the cloth bolts and measured with his eyes. He chose a length the color of dust at evening, a shade that would not announce itself to anyone who did not bother to look. For her, he told the air, not the men, and laid the coin down without waiting for change to make its slow journey across the counter. A comb followed, plain, with teeth enough to argue with hair. 2 hairpins and a paper sleeve. He added needles, though she had bought them yesterday. The clerk wrote numbers with a pencil that had been sharpened more with teeth than knife. On the way back to the door, a voice rose from the stove. It came wrapped in a laugh that had learned to hide inside words. "Looks like someone found Charity." The sentence drifted like smoke. He did not turn. He steadied the door with the flat of his hand so it would not slap her shoulder when she passed. She stepped through and kept walking until sunlight made the boards glare. Only then did she let breath out of herself and bring the back of her hand to her mouth as if to wipe away the taste of old ash. He placed the bundle in her arms. Cloth, comb, pins. The weight did not bruise. She lifted her chin a fraction and squared the parcel against her chest. He moved the rein from one post to another so the horse would not spook at a wagon that had decided to rattle. No words. The work of leaving town requires hands more than mouths. They walked past the barber, past a window where glass remembered every winter, past a woman sweeping her step who looked at the broom as if it were a man she did not trust but was willing to keep. At the corner, a child dropped a stick and stared at the new boots. The child's mother pulled gently at the small shoulder and kissed the hair once. Quick. Not pity, recognition. The smallest courtesies hold more than sermons. At the edge of the boards, he set his palm open near her elbow. She chose to put her sleeve against it when they stepped down to dirt. The horse shook its head, eager for the open track. He mounted and reached for her hand this time. She took it. Light pressure, boot in stirrup, swing, settle. The old boots would have slipped. The new ones did not. He felt that truth in the line where rain meets hand and let it travel his arm like a quiet fire. The road home told its same long story. She unwrapped the cloth and held it across her knees to test the fall. Wind pressed it flat, then let it go. She pictured seams, a straight hem, a neckline that would not argue with her bones. She folded it back and retied the string. At the ridge, the world widened. The willow lay to the right like a map that had been folded too many times. The house waited with its shoulders even. He swung down at the gate, lifted the latch, and led the horse through. She dismounted without help. This time he let his hand drop before asking to keep her steady. She did not stumble. Boots firmed the ground beneath her. The yard accepted them. Inside, she set the cloth on the table and the comb beside the mug with the crack. She placed the pins in the saucer, heads aligned, the line pointing toward the window as if to tell light where to come in. He hung the bridle, checked the cinch as habit, and set the saddle on its peg with a care a man keeps, even when no one watches. Then he took a strip of cedar and a plane and began to cut a length for a row of pegs he had not planned but must have known he would make. He measured the span above the door and marked 3 places. He drilled by hand, patient circles of wood lifting like the shells of small birds. He set the pegs with glue and tapped them home with the heel of his palm. The sound made a short, honest music that rooms learned to love. He wiped the line with a cloth and stepped back. 3 pegs held to the wall like a promise divided into parts. She brought her shawl and hung it on the left peg. He set his hat on the right. The middle remained empty, not an absence, a space reserved by quiet consent. They did not look at it long. They let it be. She took the comb and drew it through her hair, slow strokes that taught it direction without scolding. She twisted the length, lifted a coil, and anchored it with one of the new pins. The motion was small and steady, and made a different woman stand in the window than the one who had walked the boards. Not prettier, truer. The pin held. She set the comb on the shelf and did not hide the used hairpin sleeve behind tins. She left it where a hand could find it tomorrow. He opened the drawer where tools had learned their places and laid the plane in the same angle it had enjoyed last time. He wiped the cedar curls into his palm and fed them to the stove, not for heat but for smell. The air took on a sweetness that did not argue with the coffee. He carried in water and left the bucket where feet would not trip in the dark. She measured flour and pressed 2 fingers into it to see how the last loaf had taught the jar to settle. The mark remained until she smoothed it with the back of the spoon. After supper, bread, a little grease warmed into something that could pass for comfort. Coffee thinned so night would not punish them. He brought the paper from her satchel and laid it on the table. The old notice. She did not touch it. He reached for his knife, cut the paper in 2, then in 4, not savage, just even, and set the pieces aside for kindling. She watched, lips closed, eyes steady. He put the kindling in a tidy stack beside the stove. Tomorrow's flame would learn to start from what once called itself an invitation. They sat by the door a while. The new pegs held their shapes. A moth found the lamplight and remembered the dark again. Outside, the yard settled. The house had learned their rhythms. Boots off, shawl hung, hat placed, cloth folded, lamp turned down enough to leave edges, not erase them. Somewhere, those men by the store stove were still laughing at something. Laughter like that can run a long time without needing reason. Here, the sound did not arrive. Here, a comb lay on a shelf, a woman's hair obeyed, a row of pegs waited for years that had not yet shown their faces. Here, mockery thinned where it met work done right, and a life measured itself out in acts small enough to fit a hand. The fence had learned to argue over the years. Wire rusted to the color of old blood, staples loosened by frost and summer heat, posts leaning as if listening too hard to whine. He set a new cedar into earth that had grown stubborn and drove it down with both hands until the grain remembered vertical. The wire snapped back when he pulled it, fast, mean, like a snake striking. It caught his palm and opened it before he had time to be careful. He wrapped the hand in his kerchief and finished the run. Work sometimes asked to be paid at once. He paid it. By the time he reached the yard, the cloth had darkened to a color no one mistakes. He stood a moment near the pump so the horse would not take his smell for fear, and then pushed the door with his shoulder because the latch did not deserve blood. She was at the table, rolling out dough with a glass that had lost its mate. She saw the hand as a doctor sees fever, from across a room without words. She set the glass down and moved the kettle to the center of the stove, where heat spoke plain. He went to the basin and unknotted the cloth. The air found the cut and made it honest. She did not scold. She did not flinch. She brought a clean bowl, poured water that steamed the small window, and broke a sliver of lye into her palm to shave off a harmless edge. She rinsed the soap away until the water ran only pink and then only clear. He watched the ceiling and let his breath count nails. On the shelf sat the tin of waxed thread they had bought when the morning still belonged to town. She took it down, threaded a needle with a line no thicker than a whisper, and bent close. He offered the hand without bravado, palm turned, finger steady. The mouth tightens for a man who has forgotten speech. She set her left hand under his to take the weight and worked with the right, small, even passes that taught skin to meet again. The room was quiet except for the soft click of needle against itself and the stove's patient talk. She knotted the end and pressed the knot flat with a thumb. He did not pull away. She tore a strip from an old shirt that had already given up its elbows and wound the cloth firm, not cruel. The knot sat where it would not catch. She lifted his wrist once to be sure blood would not think to argue. It did not. He poured water with his good hand and set the cup within reach of hers. She did not drink at first. She looked at his palm instead, at the dark map that work leaves on a man. Callous like bark, old burns grown pale, the new line stitched like a railroad built with patience. Only then did she take the cup and sip slowly until the steam was gone. He flexed his fingers once. The bandage held. He lowered his hand and let it rest open on the table, not as display, only as acceptance. She reached for the glass again, pressed the dough flat, and set it near the stove's lip to rise. He took the screwdriver from the drawer and made himself useful with 2 turns on the loose latch, as if to prove the day could still be corrected. When the bread went in, she rinsed the bowl and laid the needle to dry on the saucer with the hairpins. It looked at home among women's work, though it had just served a man. She cleaned the table with a circle of cloth and left no trace of what had been done, except the quiet. He stepped to the porch for air that would not smell of iron, and let the weight of the sky sit across his shoulders. He looked at the fence line, straight now against the ridge, and did not measure the cost out loud. When he came back in, she had placed his kerchief, washed, wrung, folded, on the windowsill to learn sunlight again. She had also set his shirt on the bench with a length of thread through the needle's eye. He sat, and she picked a broken seam at the shoulder apart to where honesty began. Then she stitched it true while he held the cloth so it would not pull. The bread came out with a crust a shade darker than good manners. They liked it. She cut the end, steam rising, and put the rough heel in his good hand as if to teach pain something sweet. He ate standing. She ate sitting, elbows on her knees, the kind of posture that belongs to people who have worked all day and do not apologize for it. After, she lifted the mended shirt and shook it once to test the seam. He took it without ceremony. The fabric remembered his shoulders. He buttoned slowly so the bandage would not complain. The room watched them learn this small choreography. He walked to the new row of pegs and hung the shirt there, the middle peg, just for a breath, then lifted it again and put it on with the care of a man who knows what has been saved for him. Outside, evening made the yard simple. The horse chewed. The coop latch held. A towhee hopped along the fence as if checking the line himself. Inside, she placed the needle back into its sleeve with the spare pins and set the tin of thread beside the lamp so it would be found without hunting when the world asked again. He drew water, filled the bucket to the lip, and set it near the door, where a hand half asleep will find it without error. She swept the floor with slow strokes that told the bristles where to go and where to rest. When she reached the doorway, she lifted the broom and let the last dust settle without chasing it. They sat while the stove settled. He placed his bandaged hand on the table and let the fingers loosen into the kind of open that looks like thanks if a person knows how to read it. She folded a clean cloth in half and then in half again until it made a square neat enough to stand by itself. She placed it near his elbow, not as a command but as a place to set the hand if pain asked. He did. The cloth took the weight. She did not look down at the hand. She looked at the door and listened to the yard become night. He lifted his chin toward the pegs. Left, shawl. Right, hat. Middle, empty. She saw the line he had drawn without a knife and did not press it with words. When the lamp went low, she rose first and set the bread in cloth, a small burial until morning. He stood and checked the latch without rattling it. They moved through the house with the accuracy of people who have decided to stay. In her small room, she sat on the edge of the bed and unpinned her hair. The comb made its quiet path, teeth catching and then persuading. In his room, he unwrapped the bandage, looked at the stitches once in the mirror. A clouded plate hung where a mirror thought it might belong, then wrapped the hand again. Tighter. Better. He blew the lamp. The cut pulsed with a slow honesty, a metronome set to survival. Between their doors, a strip of floor held the warmth of the day. The house breathed. Outside, a coyote sang a single note and remembered loneliness enough to stop. Inside, two people lay down not because the world had grown kind, but because the work they had done for each other had made the night different than it had been. By noon, the air lost its shape. Heat lay over the grass like glass. The ridge wore a thin white edge, and even flies kept low. She set the cloth from town across the table and cut it with the good scissors he had found at the back of a drawer. Chalk from a stub made pale lines that decided the fall. She pinned without hurry, turned a seam, and set the first stitch. The needle went in and out as if it had always known this house. He mended the lower fence where soil had slumped. The bandaged hand learned a new way to hold the post driver. Sweat ran and took dust with it. When he lifted his head, the western sky had turned the color of hammered pewter. Wind came down as if pushed by a broad palm. The grass laid itself flat and then tried to stand again. He crossed the yard with a rope over his shoulder and a look that counted. She felt the change before he spoke. He did not speak. He set a bucket by the pump, then a second. She drew water until the handle squealed and the iron remembered use. He soaked 2 burlap sacks and left them to drink. The first grit hit the window like a handful of nails. Chickens scattered under the porch. The horse shivered in the stall and pressed its head to the plank. He moved along the eaves and checked each hook with quick fingers. She carried the wash to the line and unpinned cloth that would otherwise turn into flags and fly. She folded wet things fast, pressing out what weight she could, and stacked them by the door. The sky folded again. Far off, a brown wall lifted. Not fire, not rain, just wind and earth and old leaves teaching panic. The world narrowed to a yard, a fence, a roof line that must stay. He tied the barn door with double knots and set a post against it at an angle the hinges would honor. She shut the shutters on the windward side and laid a rag across the sill so dust would not learn the cracks too easily. When it hit, the house braced. Boards spoke in their small languages. He leaned into the door with his shoulder and set the latch so it could work without breaking. She wet a cloth and tied it at her mouth, then did the same for him with hands that did not tremble. He did not refuse. They stood as if the house needed their backs to remember itself. A moment between gusts gave sound back. In that small breath, he looked to the coop. The latch he had set yesterday held. A loose panel rattled. He went. She followed with one of the wet sacks. They moved low, heads down, the yard stinging their eyes as if the air had learned spite. At the coop, he pressed the panel with both palms while she wedged a slat and nailed it twice with the small hammer he carried under his coat on days like this. The head set true. The panel shut its complaints. A tin pan flipped and skittered toward the fence. She caught it with her foot, stooped, and slid it under the porch where wind would need manners to fetch it. He checked the tie at the gate and drove a stake deeper with 4 short blows. The rope learned obedience again. Dust found the keyholes. Dust found the hinge lines. She tore a strip from the old sheet and drifted it into the door's crack. Then she took the second wet sack and hung it over the threshold on 2 nails, as if building a new lung. He brought in the last tools, rags over their metal so they would not sing and scare the horse. The light turned the color of weak tea. Day lost its edges. The house stood in a box of noise. In that box, work continued. She moved the kettle to the front of the stove and kept the lid near so it would not spit. He lifted the water bucket and set it beside the door, in case the air changed its mind and found flame somewhere beyond the ridge. They did not hope for that to stay untrue. They prepared, and that was enough. When the worst pressed, they sat on the floor by the table where the world could not see them if the window forgot its duty. He set his back to the leg and made a wall of himself where the glass looked thin. She counted the breath of the gusts and matched her lungs to the slow parts between. A board popped. Another answered. The house held. She thought of laughter by the store stove and found it small now. A toy someone drops when weather raises its voice. She thought of the old notice turned into kindling and decided they had lit more than a fire with that cutting. She thought of boots that fit in a row of pegs with one space left. Her hands cooled, her jaw unclenched. When the wind tired of them, it left in strips. Sound loosened. The horse called once, not in fear but in argument with silence. He stood and went to the door. She followed and lifted the wet sack. The latch moved. He opened the door a hand's width. Air came without teeth. Outside, the yard had learned new lines. A bucket lay on its side like a gutted fish. The stump held the axe as if proud of it. The fence leaned, not broken, only thoughtful. Overhead, a strip of clean sky cut the dark like a ribbon. He stepped out and turned his face to it as a thirsty man tips a cup. She walked the yard and lifted what had fallen, not as rescue, just as care returned to its rounds. The cloth on the table had gathered a ruffle of dust at its edge. She shook it gently, took it outside, and beat it against her thigh until the color came back. She brought it in and laid it flat again. Pins held. The seam she had started had not wandered. Work waits when told properly. He checked the barn. The post had held the door. The latch at the coop stood true. He fetched a shovel and flattened the little ridge of earth the wind had thrown at the step. Then he untied the sacks at the pump, wrung them hard, and hung them over the rail to dry in a sun that had remembered its job. He looked at his bandaged hand and flexed. The stitches held. He let the arm hang loose and allowed pain to finish its sentence without making it repeat itself. She put water to boil for coffee that might taste of grit and decided that would be fine. She wiped the window with the back of her wrist and left a clean streak through which the ridge looked honest again. She set the comb on the shelf, then lifted it and placed it straighter. Not for anyone else, only for the small order that helps a mind sit down. He took the saw and trimmed a limb from the old willow that had thrown itself against the fence in panic. The cut was clean. He dragged the limb to the woodpile and made it into lengths that would warm a winter day that had not yet asked for help. He fed a handful of curls to the stove. The kettle rattled once and settled. They ate late. Flatbread browned again, beans reminded, coffee thin but hot. Dust had salted everything. They did not mind. They stood at the doorway with cups and watched the light find its yellow again. The world had not ended. It had only shouted. They had stood still until it forgot what it wanted. After she returned to the cloth. Needle, hem. The seam grew, patient, honest. He lifted the chair and turned it toward the window so the last of the day would fall across the table just where her hands worked. Then he stepped to the porch and cut a short piece of cedar. He shaved it down to a smooth, narrow stick and brought it in. He set it on the sill near her elbow. A measuring rod. No talk about it. She used it on the next line and nodded without looking at him. Evening drifted down. He lit the lamp low. The house smelled of hot iron, wet burlap, and the faint, bitter comfort of coffee. She tied off a thread, bit it clean, and laid the new dress across the table to cool like bread. He set his palm flat on the grain and felt the quiet travel up his arm. The day had taken much and asked for more. They had given what they could and kept enough. Before sleep, he went out and checked the fence one last time, hand at each post, a short push to test its desire to stand. It stood. She hung the burlap sacks by the stove to dry through and be ready again. She cleaned the kettle's lip with the corner of a cloth until metal shone through the dust. Small circles, no fuss. When they put out the lamp, the dark returned kindly. The house did not creak as much. The floor kept the heat. On the table, the new dress waited with pins like stars, and under the window, the cedar stick smelled of rain that had not fallen. Somewhere on the ridge, the wind thought about them and then thought about somewhere else. She finished the dress before noon, and by evening the house seemed to greet her as if it had finally remembered the word welcome. She shook the cloth once in the yard and watched it catch a square of light. The seam lay straight, the hem obedient, the line at the neck untroubled. She slipped it over her head in the small room and smoothed the fabric with both palms, as if telling the day to behave. The new boots stood at the bed's foot, toes pointed toward a future they intended to meet. She sat and drew them on. Leather yielded without argument. In the kitchen, the air held yesterday's coffee and the clean after-smell of boiled water. She folded the old dress and set it in the trunk, not on top, not at bottom, a middle place that said it would be used again when work asked for what was already broken in. On the peg row by the door, her shawl hung left, his hat right, the center a space kept like a pause. She looked at that gap a heartbeat longer than she meant to, then took up the basin and wiped the table so the grain would show. He came from the barn with a short board under his arm, cedar planed to a pale body and a handle cut from its own width. A bread peel, small and honest. He set it on the windowsill where light could test its surface. He ran a thumb along the edge and found no splinters. He did not say what it was. He did not need to. She rested her hand on the handle and felt the promise a tool will make if it expects to be used for years. He carried the plane back to the porch and returned with his pocket knife. On the peel's underside, hidden from a room that has not earned boasting, he cut 2 small lines crossed its center, then stepped back and turned the board so his mark would face the wood whenever bread slid from heat. She watched him sign the thing he had made and felt the act land inside her in a quiet place where fear had been living. She reached for needle and thread and did the same on her own work. 2 short stitches at the hems inside, near the left seam, nothing anyone would see unless they were the sort to kneel for truth. She did not look up to check if he noticed. He did. They worked the afternoon in slow pieces. He set a fresh bead of glue in the chair's rung that sometimes sighed when weight found it. She sifted flour with a hand that had learned the measure of air between grains. He brought in water and left the bucket where sleepy feet would not fight it. She rubbed a smear of lard into the stove door's hinge until the swing gave up its protest. By dusk, the house answered more gently to being lived in. She took the small paper of yeast from its shelf and woke it. The dough gathered steady under her hands, held its shape when she asked, and gave when she asked again. She cupped it, turned it, laid it in the bowl, covered it with a cloth that had once been a curtain for someone else's window. He whittled a restless curl from a strip of cedar and dropped it into the stove, where it learned flame with no complaint. He filled 2 cups and set them aside to cool. Heat should be shared, so should patience. Near sundown, a fretful breeze ran across the yard like a child who has been told not to run and does it anyway. He stepped to the porch to listen for change and heard none that required hands. She lifted the cloth. The dough had risen as if it wanted to be worthy. She turned it again and placed it in the iron pot, the new peel waiting like a held breath. He stood beside the stove without coming between her and it, a man-made wall that kept nothing out but accident. They ate the last of yesterday's bread, while today's learned itself. Beans softened. Salt did its plain duty. When the pot gave the smell they had been hoping for, he opened the stove door and she slid the loaf out onto the peel. The crust split where it should. He held the board steady with his bandaged hand and did not wince. She set the bread on the table, and the room became a place that knew how to invite. After the first slices were gone, and the taste still warmed their mouths, she lifted the loaf to wrap it. He turned the peel and looked at the crossed lines hidden there. He lifted his eyes to her. She touched the inside of her hem with 2 fingers. It was enough. On the porch, the rail waited unmarked. He took the knife again, looked at the top edge where rain would lift any promise he cut, and chose elsewhere. Underneath, where fingers sometimes find a lip when a body leans to tell the land a secret, he worked slow. Not names, not the open pride that begs to be read. Only the first letter of hers, plain, and beside it, his 2 lines. He kept the cut shallow so wood would not bleed in weather. He swept the shavings into his palm and fed them to the stove, because some beginnings are better burned into warmth than left for wind to scatter. She stepped out and rested her elbows where the rail met its post. She did not look down. She watched the ridge hold its violet. She breathed the hour and let it fill her until there was less room for the past to sit up and complain. He stood near enough that the boards beneath them learned the weight of 2. When dark arrived with its quiet permission, they set the lamp low and let the room be edges and glow. She fetched the comb and drew it through her hair, then pinned it up with one of the new pins. The movement clean. He took the chair and gave it a small test. No wobble. He set it at the table and left it there, as if the furniture had decided to keep its promise without being told. Before sleep, she brought the basin to her room and rinsed the dust from her wrists as if to wash away what the day had not asked her to carry. He checked the latch and then, for once, did not press it twice. He stood in the doorway of his room and touched the frame with the backs of his fingers, the way a man will touch a horse he has not yet decided to ride. She blew her lamp. He blew his. Between them, the house held a list of small proofs: a hem that would not unravel, a peel signed on its hidden side, a rail with a truth beneath it, a chair that did not wobble, 2 cups that had learned each other's place. The world beyond the fence could laugh itself empty. Inside, a life had moved 1 notch closer to being called a home. By morning, the cut in his palm had settled into a quiet line. The swelling was down, the skin tight but not angry. She sat him at the table and unwrapped the cloth with the care a person gives to something that has finally agreed to stay. The stitches lifted one by one, a soft tug, a soft breath, a soft release. He watched the window and let the room count for him. When she finished, she pressed the seam with her thumb and nodded once. He flexed his fingers. The hand remembered its work and did not complain. She washed the needle and set it in the sleeve with the hairpins, the 2 tools sharing one small home. Then she went to the trunk and lifted the old dress, the road-stained one that had carried her through dust and into a door that had stayed open. She did not lay it on the bed to keep. She laid it on the table to change. She cut the skirt clean, turned the edge, stitched a narrow channel, and pulled a cord through with a pin until the cloth learned to gather when asked. 2 long ties from the remaining fabric, a square of pocket from the sleeve. The work did not ask advice. It asked steadiness. She gave it. He planed a thin strip of cedar on the porch, shavings rising in light curls that made their own weather. He measured the lintel above the kitchen doorway with the small stick he had cut for her seams. He marked 2 points, bored 2 holes, set 2 pegs no wider than a thumb, and laid the strip across them as if placing a line of thought where a body might pass under it 100 times without needing to say what it means. She pulled the knot tight on the apron's tie and slipped it over her head. The fabric settled against the new dress as if it had always meant to. She touched the pocket, then the cord channel, then the place where the road had been cut away, and turned into something that would not have to walk again. She carried the apron to the pegs and stopped. Left, shawl; right, hat; middle, space. She stood with the apron's weight in her hands and watched the grain of the wood run upward, like rain reversed. He stepped in from the porch and reached for the back of the middle peg with 2 fingers to steady it. He did not look at her. He looked at the wood as if a wrong move might spook it. She lifted the apron and set its loop down. The peg took the weight. The cloth hung. The middle space was not a pause anymore. He did not touch the apron. He set his palm flat beside the pegs, as if to show he would carry the wall if it needed carrying. She rested the tips of her fingers on the board above his hand, long enough to learn its temperature. Then she let them fall away and went to the stove. Flour, water, yeast, each in its turn. He stood on her left, the healed palm open flat beneath the bowl when she tipped it, so nothing would be lost to the gap between table and hand. She turned the dough. He folded it back. They took turns until the round held its shape without their help. He oiled the iron pot with a cloth that had seen too much and was better for it. She set the dough in. The lid lowered. The heat woke. Between risings, he stepped to the doorway he had measured and lifted the cedar strip free. On the underside, where a person's eye would not go unless the heart sent it there, he cut a shallow letter, hers, plain and right, and beside it the 2 lines that had followed him through years. He turned the knife and crossed the lines at their center so the mark would not forget which part of itself holds the other 2 together. He pressed the strip back on its pegs and smoothed the edge with his thumb until cedar warmed under his skin. She wiped the table and dusted it with flour. With the corner of her hand, she drew a small line, a letter, then another, his, to sit beside it. Not deep, not permanent, only the kind of writing that bread will erase when it is ready. She left the marks there and placed the peel across them like a lid on a secret that was not hiding from anyone who knew where to look. The day ran simple. He mended a hinge at the barn that had been trying too hard to speak. She patched the elbow of his work shirt with a square from the last good piece of her old dress. He sharpened the small knife. She swept the floor with strokes that told the bristles how long to breathe. By afternoon, the loaf learned its brown, the sound of its crust hollow and right. He set the peel under it. She eased it free. They held the board together a fraction longer than duty demanded. They ate the end pieces again, salt between finger and thumb, coffee thin and clean. He placed the remaining loaf under cloth at the table's center. She set 2 plates side by side with the edges touching. The touch was not an accident. He saw it and left it. Evening arrived the way good weather does, not with a shout, but by refusing to leave. He took his hat from the right peg and turned it once, then put it back. She lifted the apron from the middle peg and shook flour into the basin, then hung it again, the loop learning its new home. They stepped to the porch. Under the rail, where wood keeps its own counsel, his knife had left the first letter of hers beside his cross lines. She did not lean down to read it. She set her elbows on the top board the way a person does when nothing needs guarding for a breath. He stood beside her, arm close enough that the night would have to pass through 2 bodies if it meant to come in. The ridge held its last light. The yard drew its line. The house behind them kept their quiet notes and played them back in warm wood and the smell of crust cooling. He did not say her name. He did not have to. She did not ask for a promise. She did not have to. The middle peg held an apron cut from a road that had finished its work. The lintel carried a letter that would outlast speech. The table remembered 2 plates touching. The chair did not wobble. The hand did not bleed. The loaf would be there in the morning. When the lamp went down, they went inside and closed the door with neither rush nor fear. He tested the latch once and left it. She touched the cedar strip with the backs of her fingers as she passed under it and felt the cut she could not see. The feeling was enough. In their rooms, they lay down in a dark that had no sharp corners. Between them, the house breathed slow and even, a chest that had learned how to sleep because somebody cared for it. The men by the store stove would find other names to laugh at. The country is wide and loud. Here, 2 quiet lives set their marks where only hands could read them. Here, a woman who had been counted out counted bread instead. Here, a man who had waited without saying so stood inside his own door and did not feel alone. In the morning, he would carry flour from the shelf without measuring it twice. In the morning, she would lift the apron from the middle peg first. The day would begin, as good days do, with work that knows what it is for.